My parents always thought my brother was the smart one and ignored my achievements. Now that he's in trouble with the law, they want me to use my success to save him, but I refused. Growing up, I always felt invisible. No matter how hard I worked, how many awards I won, or how much effort I put into making my parents proud, it was never enough. Because in their eyes, my older brother was the real star. He was the golden child, the one they believed would achieve great things. I was just there. The responsible one, the quiet one, the one who never caused trouble. And because of that, they barely noticed me. While I was studying late into the night, earning scholarships, and building a future for myself, my parents were too busy praising my brother for the smallest things. If he managed to pass a test, it was a cause for celebration. If I won an academic competition, it was barely acknowledged. It didn't matter that I was the one who worked hard, because in their eyes, he was the smart one, the one who was meant for success. But reality has a funny way of proving people wrong. As the years passed, our paths couldn't have been more different. I built a stable career, a life I was proud of. My brother, on the other hand, started making one bad decision after another. Bad friends, reckless choices, and eventually, trouble with the law. And suddenly, the same parents who had ignored my achievements all these years were at my doorstep, begging for help. They wanted me to fix things, to use my success, my connections, and even my money to save him. They expected me to drop everything and make his problems disappear, just like they had always made excuses for him growing up. For the first time, I had all the power. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let them push me aside. I looked at them, the desperation in their eyes, the fear of what could happen to their favorite child. And for a moment, I felt guilty. After all, he was still my brother. But then, I remembered every time I had been overlooked, every time they had made me feel like I wasn't enough. And I knew, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. But when I told them my decision, I never expected what happened next. For a moment, there was silence. My parents just stared at me, as if they couldn't believe what I had just said. Then, my mother's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice shaking. "He's your brother. Family helps each other." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Family is supposed to be there for each other, yes. But when was he ever there for me? When were you ever there for me? My father's jaw tightened. This isn't about the past. This is about now. You have the means to help him. Are you really going to turn your back on him when he needs you the most? I felt the weight of their words pressing down on me, but I refused to let it break me. They had spent years turning a blind eye to everything he did, making excuses for his mistakes, while expecting me to fend for myself. Now, suddenly, I was supposed to be the one to clean up his mess? I didn't put him in this situation, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And I won't be the one to get him out of it. My mother's eyes welled up with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from sadness or anger. "I don't understand how you can be so cold," she whispered. Cold. That word stung more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't heartless. I wasn't cruel. I just knew that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough for them. They weren't asking for my help because they suddenly valued me, they were asking because they had no other choice. "I'm not being cold," I said quietly. "I just refuse to keep being treated like I don't matter until it's convenient for you." My father exhaled sharply and shook his head. "You've changed," he muttered. Maybe I had. Or maybe I was just finally standing up for myself. The tension in the room was suffocating. My mother wiped her tears, my father stared at the floor, and I felt something shift between us, something that couldn't be undone. Then, my mother's voice broke through the silence. "If you don't help him, I don't know if we can ever forgive you." I should have expected it, but the words still hit like a punch to the gut. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about me finally choosing myself. I should have seen it coming, the guilt, the manipulation, the way my parents would twist the situation to make me feel like the villain. But hearing my mother say she might never forgive me still sent a sharp ache through my chest. I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, my voice quieter now, but firm. "But I can't keep fixing things for him. He has to face the consequences of his own choices." My father let out a bitter laugh. "Consequences? Do you really think you got where you are without help? Without family?" He shook his head, his disappointment written all over his face. "You act like you built your life on your own." I looked at him, stunned. Because I did. That was the truth they never wanted to acknowledge. No one had paved the way for me. No one had celebrated my successes or lifted me up when I struggled. I had worked for everything, every scholarship, every job opportunity, every step I had taken to build my life. And now, they wanted to rewrite history, to act as if we had been one big, supportive family all along. My mother's voice wavered. "You think you're better than us now, don't you?" I sighed, feeling exhausted. That's not what this is about. But they weren't listening anymore. They weren't interested in understanding my side. To them, I was abandoning my brother. And in their world, that was unforgivable. A heavy silence settled between us, and for the first time, I realized how deep the divide had become. I had always known I wasn't their priority, but I had never truly let myself believe that I could be so disposable to them. That if I didn't serve a purpose, if I wasn't useful, I wasn't worth keeping close. The thought made my stomach turn. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Probably a lawyer. Or worse, my brother himself. My mother's eyes flickered toward the phone, hopeful. "Maybe it's him," she whispered. "Maybe he needs you." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to answer, to know what he had to say. But another part, the part that had spent years being ignored and overlooked, wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. Because deep down, I knew, if I picked up that call, everything would change. My fingers hovered over the screen, my heart pounding. I could feel my parents watching me, waiting, their eyes filled with expectation. It was as if they thought answering that call would be the first step toward fixing everything, toward falling back into the role they had always assigned me, the responsible one, the one who would come through when they needed me most. But I wasn't sure if I could do that anymore. The phone buzzed again, and the vibration against the table felt almost deafening in the heavy silence of the room. My mother shifted forward, clasping her hands together like she was praying for me to pick up. My father stood rigid, his face unreadable, but his clenched jaw told me everything. I finally exhaled and reached for the phone. But just as my thumb hovered over the screen, the call ended. A breath I didn't realize I had been holding escaped my lips. My mother's face fell. A second later, a message popped up. It was from my brother. "Pick up. Please." I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. For years, we had barely spoken. He had been too busy living recklessly, and I had been too busy cleaning up the messes he left behind. And now, here he was, reaching out, when he had nowhere else to turn. I glanced at my parents. My mother looked desperate. My father looked exhausted. And suddenly, I wasn't sure what scared me more, that my brother was finally asking for my help, or that I might actually consider giving it. Another message. I messed up. Bad. A cold chill ran through me. I could almost hear his voice in my head, the same voice that had teased me relentlessly as kids, the same voice that had always been so confident, so sure of himself. But now, there was something else beneath those words. Fear. My father finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You need to talk to him." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before, uncertainty. He had always been so sure that my brother was destined for greatness, that no mistake could ever truly hurt him. But now, it was as if he was realizing, too late, that not everything could be undone. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I tightened my grip on the phone, my mind racing. If I called him back, if I let him pull me into whatever nightmare he had created, there would be no turning back. But if I didn't, would I regret it? The weight of the decision pressed down on me. My parents were still staring, their silent pleas louder than any words they could say. My brother was out there, waiting. But for what? For me to save him? For me to clean up his mess like I always had? Before I could think it through, my phone vibrated again. Another message. They're saying I did something I didn't. I swear, I didn't. A strange feeling crept up my spine. I had expected him to say he needed money, legal help, something predictable. But this? This was different. He wasn't just in trouble, he was scared. My father took a step forward. What does it say? I hesitated, then turned the phone so they could see. My mother let out a shaky breath, covering her mouth with her hands. My father's expression darkened. He's lying, he muttered, shaking his head. He always says that when he gets caught. I didn't answer. Because a part of me wasn't so sure. My brother had made bad decisions, sure. But he had never outright denied responsibility like this. Usually, he had some excuse, some way to spin it, but this time, something felt off. The phone buzzed again. You have to believe me. They're trying to pin this on me, and I don't know what to do. My stomach twisted. This wasn't like him. He wasn't the type to admit fear, not even when he should have. And yet, here he was, practically begging me to believe him. I turned away from my parents, walking a few steps toward the window. The city lights blurred in the distance as I tried to make sense of it all. What if he was telling the truth? What if, for the first time, he actually wasn't at fault? But before I could make a decision, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Hello? A low voice came through the line, calm but firm. Is this your name? I gripped the phone tighter. Who is this? The voice didn't waver. I think you should come see your brother. Now. My breath caught. The room around me seemed to shrink. This wasn't just some reckless mistake. This was bigger. And for the first time, I realized I might not be able to walk away from this after all. The voice on the other end didn't wait for me to respond. I can't say much over the phone. Just come to the station. Now. Then the line went dead. My heart pounded as I turned back to my parents. My mother's eyes were wide with fear, my father's face pale. They had heard enough to know something was wrong, more than just the usual trouble my brother got himself into. I have to go, I said, grabbing my keys. My mother reached for my arm. We're coming with you. I wanted to say no, that I needed to handle this alone. But I could see it in her eyes, she was barely holding it together. And despite everything, despite years of being overlooked, I wasn't heartless. I gave a short nod, and we left. The ride to the station was silent. My father stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. My mother kept wringing her hands in her lap, whispering prayers under her breath. I, on the other hand, felt numb. My mind raced with possibilities. What if my brother was guilty? What if he wasn't? And why did I feel like we were about to find out something none of us were prepared for? When we arrived, the officer at the front desk barely looked up before pointing down the hall. Third door on the left. The moment we stepped inside, my brother looked up from where he sat, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He wasn't handcuffed, which was the first relief I had felt all night. You came, he muttered. I crossed my arms. What's going on? Before he could answer, the door opened again, and another officer stepped inside. He held a file in his hands, flipping through a few pages before speaking. We've been investigating a case involving fraud, identity theft, and illegal financial activities. Initially, your brother was a suspect. My stomach dropped. My mother let out a small gasp. My father stiffened beside me. But, the officer continued, looking directly at my brother, we now believe he was set up. The room seemed to tilt. What? I breathed. The officer nodded. We found evidence that someone used his identity to commit the crimes. Bank accounts, transactions, none of them actually trace back to him. Someone else orchestrated everything, and we're working to figure out who. I turned to my brother, who looked just as shocked as I felt. You didn't do this? His voice was hoarse. I told you. I swear, I didn't. A strange mix of emotions rushed through me, guilt, relief, anger. For so long, I had assumed he was always in the wrong. But what if, just this once, he had truly been a victim? The officer cleared his throat. There's something else. He hesitated, then slid a document across the table. We have a name. The person who framed him. I leaned forward, scanning the paper. And then my breath caught. It wasn't some stranger. It wasn't some random criminal. It was someone we knew. Someone we trusted. And suddenly, everything we thought we understood about this situation, about our family, was about to change forever. I stared at the name on the paper, my mind struggling to process it. My parents leaned in, their eyes scanning the page before my mother gasped, covering her mouth. My father went completely still. The name written in black ink didn't belong to some stranger, it belonged to my uncle. My father's own brother. My brother let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course. Of course, it was him. I turned to the officer. Are you sure? He nodded. The transactions, the fake accounts, everything leads back to him. He used your brother's identity as a cover. We believe he thought your family would assume the worst about him and never question it. My mother sank into a chair, whispering, how could he do this? My father clenched his fists, his jaw tight. I had never seen him look so betrayed. He and my uncle had always been close, but now, everything they had built between them was shattered. I turned back to my brother. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a mix of relief and sadness. He had spent so long being blamed, so long feeling like the family's failure, that even being proven innocent didn't erase the damage. The officer cleared his throat. We'll be pressing charges against your uncle. Your brother is free to go. For the first time that night, I exhaled fully. It was over. The nightmare, the accusations, everything. As we walked out of the station together, the air felt lighter, but I knew things wouldn't go back to the way they were. My family had cracks now, deep ones that couldn't be ignored. But as I glanced at my brother, I realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, I saw him not as the reckless troublemaker my parents had always painted him to be, but as a person who had been struggling, trying, failing, and now, finally, being heard. Outside, my brother hesitated before turning to me. Thank you, he said quietly. For believing me, even if it took a while. I nodded. You would have done the same for me. A small smile tugged at his lips. I don't know about that. I smirked. Then I guess we're even. As we got into the car, my father sighed. We have a lot to fix. We did. But for the first time, it felt like we actually could.